so it's Two Roads Leadership. The reason it's called Two Roads Leadership is we're always standing at a fork in the road, whether we realize it or not. When you're 20, it's a lot different road than when you're where you're at in your career. You know, Rosalie's just starting out. You've finished one and started a second career.
Yeah.
So whether it's personal or professional, we're trying to have conversations that inform what we're learning and what we might offer our peers. So that's what I was trying to get in the essay that I sent you, and that we'll publish today. If there's any, did I miss the point on any of them, or if there's something that's entirely missing, don't hesitate to jump in. So with that,
Yeah,
I'll
sure.
pass it over to you and let you introduce yourself and whatever comes to mind.
Yeah, JR, you know me reasonably well, but for wider dissemination, I joined the army when I was an 18-year-old. My father was old-fashioned. I think that's the best way to term it nowadays. He didn't believe I needed an adult education, and he took me from my school and took me on a walking holiday to the Lake District. And after 2 weeks of walking, he took me to the recruiting office and said, "Son, it's time you signed up for a proper career." So I joined the army at 18. I never went to university. And I joined, like you, JR, as a private soldier. Did a little bit of time prior enlisted before being selected for officer training and going to Sandhurst. And that's been my career for 34 years, from man and boy. I was commissioned into the artillery, which is, it's a family tradition to stay within the artillery, but it's an interesting post to be because you sort of sit in both the sort of command and staff element. There's a staff element to providing support to your maneuver arm, from a technical perspective, but you're still commanding your own troops. So it's a strange hybrid role, which actually I found remarkably useful now when operating in a virtual reality, and we can touch on that later. I spent most of my career on the operational side. I think in American terms that's the great currency. In British terms, not necessarily. The British rather like you to flip between the sort of the operations and the staff to build up a more generalized officer. I rarely achieved the staff side. I spent time on operations, did 3 tours in Iraq, 91, 2003 and 2015, 2 tours to Afghanistan, 2 to Bosnia, and I went with the United Nations twice to Cyprus and Cambodia. But it was fairly early on in my career that I took one of those 2 roads that you discussed. One was the easy road, and one was the less easy and less trodden road, but it's the one I chose. And that was basically at a time when it was not fashionable. I wanted to go down a multinational route. I felt that some of the large international organizations like the United Nations were interesting areas to explore, but more importantly, I felt that operating with partners was the way ahead. I think the United Kingdom had always rather felt it could operate as a single entity, but I felt that actually the multinational was the more chosen route. And when you look at the shared values across the world that we have, across the Atlantic with America, with our great allies in Australia and New Zealand, that's where I wanted to push. And so I shifted my entire perception into a more multinational setting. I went to Australia for a year to do education, which gave me an incredibly different perspective on different part of the world, particularly the Indo-PACOM area. And for the last 10 years, I have almost exclusively worked with what the UK would consider its number 1 partner, which is the United States. And I've been incredibly blessed to do staff tours at the Pentagon, at the US Central Command. But probably the highlight of my life, and something that will never change, as a Deputy Commanding General in the 82nd Airborne, which, you know, has to rank up there as one of the greatest opportunities to lead soldiers from a different nationality, but with a very similar mindset and similar background, not just in a camp environment with the standard exercising and training, but to deploy with them to Iraq for 9 months as the deputy commander, and have the opportunity to see how soldiers operate firsthand under stress. So I've had a unique opportunity, you know, working with the British military, working latterly with the American military. And then, you know, when I retired in December, you know, looking for alternative careers, you know, the one thing I wanted to do was to continue to give back. I've always been in public service all my life. That's all I've ever wanted to do. And so when the opportunity came to admittedly switch tack to the Air Force and the United States Air Force, to me, it was too good an opportunity to miss. It allows me to maintain that link that I cherish, to give back to my adopted country, but also to do something that I genuinely enjoy doing. So that's where you find me today.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? And we should probably talk about that a little bit, because I'm a Marine and you're a soldier, and our primary customer is the Air Force. And so, well, not for the company, but for the projects that we're working. And how did you navigate? Not only now are you civilian, but now you're a civilian working for the Air Force when you've spent your entire life in the Army. I know I find myself every day thinking about the irony of that. So I'll let you jump in there.
No, look, I mean, there's a wonderful irony about it. You know, my father's always had, you know, stories about the Royal Air Force and his run-ins with them over the years. But as an artilleryman, of course, our principal benefactor has always been the Air Force. When you think about it, you know, I mean, indirect fire comes from a number of systems. Some of them are land-based, but actually, in modern operations, whether it's through remotely piloted vehicles or through air-delivered munitions from, you know, a piloted vehicle, actually the Air Force is our number one customer. And in my latter years, as you get into higher formations and work, you know, in more complex battle space, actually most of my officers have been from the Air Force. So in some ways, it's not been entirely surprising then that, you know, that the Air Force, you know, I've ended up working with the Air Force. There are differences. In my entire life has been spent learning different acronyms. You know, you learn British acronyms, then you learn United Nations, then NATO, then American Army, and then suddenly you're now in another one with more acronyms. And I don't think my entire life will ever finish without learning more acronyms. And, you know, when you look at different sort of officers, you know, I just got used to understanding the US Army. I'm now dealing with another customer with different, you know, numerical codes and, you know, different indicators for their various departments. But you know what? It's the same culture. It's just in a slightly different uniform. It's the same culture, it's the same people, it's the same professional determination. So frankly, it's not that difficult. And one of the things I've enjoyed most is that people are remarkably sympathetic to me, you know, as you get up to speed, and they're more than willing to reach out and to help you. And that's not just our home team in Flata, but that's actually our customer as well. You know, phone calls today from people just reaching out to have a chat, make sure we're on the same way. That's what it's all about.
So talk to us a little bit about going from being a high-ranking officer in a very prestigious role out of the military and into the business world. Talk to us a little bit about that transition, some of your joys and some of your frustrations.
Oh, you know, I mean, there's probably a million frustrations. I think genuinely for me, it was a sense of trepidation. You know, when you've been payrolled by an organization for your whole life, where there's a sort of degree of certainty that at the end of each month, you're going to get a paycheck. And there's a comfort that goes with the military culture, and you don't get paid fabulously well, but equally you don't get paid particularly badly. I mean, it's quite a nice sense of security. And so at the point where you decide that retirement is coming, it becomes something that sort of, it's nervous. It's a nervous tension. Compounded in my case by the fact that I decided to stay in America rather than return back to the United Kingdom. So there's a whole raft of immigration issues that go with it. There's also the complexity of finding a job, particularly where nationality and citizenship become key determinants. There are certain jobs that you just cannot do unless you are an American citizen, and that becomes part of the calculus. So I think from my perspective, I was nervous about the transition. People had asked me, what is it you want to do? And I found it very hard. I couldn't sort of say I want to go into business. I didn't want to run my own business. I knew geographically where I wanted to be. And I knew deep down in my heart that I wanted to continue working, if I could, within an organization that kept me linked to the military. But finding that job was difficult. And, Joe, I think, you know full well, I utilized my vast network of one person to help me out. And, General Votel was very kind to not only chat to me and listen to me, but also to put some recommendations in the right way. I never doubted my ability to be able to work. I just wondered what work would come that would eventually find me. So I think transition is nerve-wracking at the best of times. I did courses back in the United Kingdom which were useful to provide some pointers, but frankly not massively useful in terms of networking, because all of them are very much focused on the national base rather than an international base. So I think, yeah, I found it quite nerve-wracking. And certainly when you start to put in your sort of job applications, it's hard to know what to expect. And, as I look back on the period, of course, I was applying for jobs from a military optic rather than from a civilian optic. What is it the civil sector wants to hear from you? And how do you sell yourself in a civil perspective? Project management is a very finite and specialized skill that civilian personnel do a lot of background training to achieve. In the military, we do it, but maybe in a different way. And so how do you get yourself attractive to the market without sounding too military? And I think that's one of the challenges I had to overcome was, how do you make yourself more marketable to a civil audience? And that's a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think your case is a classic study in relationship building, because you came recommended by someone that rarely ever recommends people and has such a strong reputation themselves as their opinion is unimpeachable. But for people who don't know four-star generals of such strong reputation, I always tell people, if you're looking for a job, you're going to get it from a person. You're not going to get it from your resume in a stack of 100 other resumes. So put down your pen and pick up the phone and start calling people and keep a log of who you call. I did this as I was transitioning. I didn't think I was going to be able to start Flatter right away. I thought I was going to have to lily pad through one of the bigs, or I didn't know the market at all, just like you, as I was transitioning, getting to know the labor market that hires retired military or former government civil servants. So there's a steep learning curve there. I got the advice to start calling people, and I kept a journal of who I called. And by the time I was done, I had 65 pages of entries in my journal of who I'd talked to and what they had told me, who they referred me to. And that became the foundation of my network to run my business. I was fortunate that I was able to start it literally the day I walked out of the military. So I was fortunate in that regard.
And
Go ahead.
you know, the courses I had done in the United Kingdom that sort of prepare you for transition, they had focused very much on the fact that very rarely will you get a job from applying. The majority of jobs you get will come from a network that you have to cultivate. And so, I mean, I was aware of that, and like I'd looked to that network as a source of inspiration, and I'd actually had a very good conversation with a colleague I'd worked with many years ago called Marty Schweitzer. Marty works at the moment for the McChrystal Foundation, and I'd had a chat with him, and he had done this the hard way himself, and he had said, when you're looking for a job, it's like an artillery targeting. You're trying to identify individuals. You're trying to work out why you want to speak to them. What can that person do to help you? And he says, out of your LinkedIn page of, let's say, 1,000 people, actually only a fraction of those, a small handful, are going to be genuinely useful as you start to navigate into a different world and a different market. And he says, you've got to be quite selective in who those are. And I think that advice actually helps, getting back to your point. You start to look at who can help you, you start to work out why, and then you start to work with those individuals as best you can to try and find the best fit. So, I mean, the advice is absolutely right. And, building up that network of people, is the critical component, I think, of finding the quick transition from a military role to a civilian. I would just point out that, I was worried whether, you could transition after being in the military for so long. The reality is actually, I found it surprisingly easy. 34 years is a long time to run up and down the streets, put a heavy pack on your back and jump out of airplanes. And there comes a point where, I've done a number of deployments, and frankly, I was ready for it. I think my body was telling me I was ready for it. I think my soul was telling me I was ready for it. And my wife was certainly telling me I was ready for it. So it wasn't that difficult, actually, to transition. I thought it would be harder, but it wasn't that difficult.
So one of the topics we wanted to talk about this week and share some lessons learned, if you will, of what I'm calling go fast, stop, go fast, stop. For the last 6 months, well, maybe even more, because pre-COVID, we were doing go fast, stop as well, but for different reasons. So I've watched you and your team plan these complex events, gather the prestigious speakers whose calendars are already crushed, to promise to come to speak, and everybody gets up to the starting line and then it's canceled. And then you do it again, and then you do it again. Talk to us about your leadership, how you keep your team motivated. Because I had Jenna and Morgan in my notes here. Make sure we do a shout out for them, because they've been doing magnificent, and Lindsay and Bill and all the other members of the team. Those are just the two that I've worked with the closest on these last couple of events. But talk to us about your own mind and leadership of yourself, and then your leadership of this team.
Yeah, look, I joined the company in early March, and it was a time when we were building up the team. It was a small team then. It's a slightly bigger team now, but we were building, and I think that about 3 or 4 of us arrived at almost exactly the same time. And when I say early March, you'll notice the variable there. I was in the office for 1 week. I was on a course for the 2nd week, and we were in quarantine the 3rd week. Because the reality was we had met briefly to the point where you recognize people in the street, but we'd not really had the opportunity to get to know each other particularly well in an in-person setting before we went into immediate lockdown. And so I've spent my vast majority of my time with the company working through remote delivery. and working through a virtual means of communication, which, on the face of it, it is incredibly complex, particularly when you're talking small group dynamics. And we are a small team. I mean, you've mentioned some, but we've got a small team. There's not that many of us in this team, and there are demands that come from small teams, which are highly complex, and not being able to sort of meet up in person is a difficult thing to do. So, I mean, the first thing that pleasantly surprised me was how incredibly quickly we were able to switch from in-person to virtual. I mean, it was literally overnight. We all were sent home. We all got our computers up. We all got onto Zoom, and we started to operate. And I just can't believe that we could do that without missing a heartbeat. But you can only do that without missing a heartbeat. If you look at one or two what I would classify as generic principles. The first and the one that really sits at the top of my my sort of list of priorities is that when you go into virtual, you have to over communicate. You cannot afford to under communicate, because if you under communicate, people will lose touch with what is actually important and what it is you require. And I certainly, through daily interaction with the team, through one-on-one meetings with the team, through the range of technology that we've got available to you, insist on over communicating. And I tell my team, when you're sending emails out, copy me into it, because if it's not important, I'll delete it. But if it is important, then I've read it and I've got it and I've noted it, and we can use that information. And so I try and encourage a very flat command structure. There should be nothing between what Rev is saying at the top and what our youngest event planner, Lindsay, is saying at the bottom. Everyone should know. And that is borne out by my second sort of big principle, which is trust. You've got to trust people. And trust is a finite commodity. And I've been in the military, where I've had high security clearance to me, and I've operated in headquarters with high security clearances. And if you don't trust those people around you, the headquarters will become dysfunctional. You've got to actually allow individuals to do their job, and they can only do that if you trust what they're going to deliver. And that's one of the things that I've had to sort of cultivate between myself and my team, is that sense of trust. And I do it from my personal perspective, from the way I interact with them, the way I operate, and my work ethic. Because if they think that I've got their back, and if they think that I'm working hard to make their life a little bit better, I think they work in retrospect in a far more positive way to support and sustain our mission within the company. So I think trust is an incredibly important, it's a perishable commodity. You can lose trust quite quickly, but it is one you've got to have. The other part of communication, in addition to trust, is simplification. When you're in person and you're talking to people, you can deal with relatively complex matters, and you can hammer away at each other until the information is there. But when you're dealing with technology and you're dealing with Zoom, and I can only deal with one person at a time. It's not as if you can deal with multiple feeds. You can deal with one person at a time. The key to success is to simplify what you're doing to the point where individuals get it. If you make it over complex, then you're going to run into problems. And so a lot of this is all about preparing, planning, and executing. And you have to start a long way out. You have to keep chipping away at it. And you have to constantly have waypoints up to the point of delivery. And so simplification is critical. And that's what I work really hard on that with, Bill Butcher, my deputy, is to try and make sure that we make it as easy as we can for subordinates to work. The next principle I would put out that we've dealt with a lot is delegation. You have to be able to delegate, coming back to trust, and you've got to trust that when you delegate, people will do the job you need them to do. I have deep dive sessions with the team just to give them the waypoints and to keep making sure that we're going in the right direction. But outside of that, you've got to say to the girls, you've got to say to Jenna, you've got to say to Ida, you've got to say to Lindsay, you've got to say to Morgan, you've got this. You know, I trust you to be able to send an email to a 3-star officer and not embarrass me or the company. And if you do, I've got your back to pick up the pieces, but I trust in you and I delegate to you to do that. And you know what? They do it. You know, we've got a range of people from, 22-year-olds up to people in their mid-40s, and they all do it. It's just a wonderful thing when you delegate to them, you trust them, and then you see them respond in such a positive way. So the delegation is important. But the final bit, is the technology. And Jerry, we have discussed technology ad nauseum as you look to the future. But the pace of change has been so dramatic recently in terms of what you can do. I was listening to a podcast the other day on Apollo 13. And of course, when you look at the computing power they had available to them, and you look to what we're talking massive, massive computers, which had nothing like the ability of a cell phone today. We've come a long way in 30, 40 years. And as you look to the future, it's going to become even more technologically advanced as we start introducing artificial intelligence, quantum computing, all these things that we've talked about ad nauseum. So the technology exists, and you've got to start trusting the technology, and it is generating alternate work practices. I never would have been a believer in telework 6 months ago. Mm-hmm. But I'm sitting here now saying to you as my chief learning officer and as the chairman, do you know what? There's a lot to be said for this. We're getting a lot more out of our team because they're operating from the home environment, because they're not having to do long commutes. They're putting in some really long hours and putting out some really good work. And I'm not saying that we don't ever go back to in-person. I think there's a healthy balance out there. But by golly, technology allows us to do this, whether it's through some of these virtual platforms, Zoom, WebEx, Teams, or whether it's just through the straightforward exchange of emails. We have a SharePoint, we have a learning management system, all these things we've had to develop. And we've had to develop procedures to allow us to do this. But it's amazing what technology will allow us to do. So, those are some of the principles that that I've been operating in with the team, which I've learned from my experience, through the military. That those are some of the key aspects that I would have expected in the military, and you know what, they translate pretty well into civilian life as well.
Yeah, you bring up a theme. Well, you bring up several themes. But the one that comes to mind is delegate before you have to. Of all the things we do as leaders, delegating requires the most courage in many ways, because you know what the task is, you know the level of excellence that you would do it, and you know that the person you're passing the task to isn't as experienced as you. And so there's a risk factor in there, but you do it nonetheless, because eventually you're not going to have the choice. You're going to have to delegate. Either time or other requirements are going to take you away. And so I always tell people, delegate before you have to. Demonstrate that courage when the risk is relatively low, rather than when it's high and suddenly that's the only choice you have. I tell a story. As a matter of fact, I was teaching last week a group of senior civilians, civil servants, and I told the story about going on an unexpected 51-day work stop and coming back, and my inbox was empty. And it's one of the proudest moments I have as a leader, because my team knew exactly what they needed to do. They did everything they needed to do. The same level of excellence. It was being done before. And it just demonstrated to me that I had been doing things right. And suddenly I wasn't there unexpectedly, and came back, and It was like I had never left. And you might wonder, well, why do I need to be there at all? Well, that 52nd day, the wheels start wiggling a little bit. 90 days, 180 days, the wheels might start falling off because they need that leadership that we provide. So, any thoughts, comments from your own history?
I think, well, look, I think one of the things that the military drives into you is your work ethic, and that's good, but it also makes you think you're totally indispensable. And I've seen this too often with commanders who, as time progresses, become more and more tired, and they can't recognize they're becoming tired, and they can't recognize that their decision making becomes a little bit faulty because of that. And the reason they're doing that is because they think they're indispensable to the mission. If they go, they're so important that the mission will fail without them. And I spend a lot of time saying, look, if you were to disappear tomorrow, this headquarters would somehow continue to function. And the sun would still rise tomorrow morning, and it would still set sometime tomorrow evening, and we would make it work. And don't get me wrong, we may not be optimal. We do like having you with that sort of soft hand to provide the strategic direction and guidance we need. But we can make this work, and you've got to get a rest in order to recharge your batteries to do it. And I had an incredibly enlightened commander in Iraq in 2015, 2016, a guy called General Rich Clark, who's currently the commander of the Special Operations Command. And he was my boss. And he said at one stage, I've got to go back to the United States for 2 weeks. You've got this. At the same time that he went, the 3-star commander also left. And he said, you've got this. And so I, as an allied British officer, were accompanying the American ambassador on all sorts of national meetings because, frankly, we just got on with it. And you know what? The mission didn't collapse. It may not have been as good as it was with our senior leaders there. But when they came back, full of energy, full of determination, they were ready to go again. And I think sometimes people don't recognize that they are, that they are not indispensable. You've got to build that into your battle rhythm and your life. And that allows, and only achieve that if you've got the trust of your team and you're able to delegate appropriately across the team. And I think, one of the books that I think had, quite a profound influence on me, particularly in transition, was by General Stanley McChrystal when he wrote his Team of Teams. Because I read that and nothing he said was a surprise to me, but he had written it down on paper. And I thought it was an incredibly enlightening book because it reflected all that I believed in how a leader should operate. And, as I look back at my time in Central Command with General Votel, I saw the same sort of leadership pattern and the leadership style there, the flattened structures, the trust that they had, the delegation, but most importantly, the ability to operate within the intent of the commander. If the commander is able to lay out his intent appropriately and correctly, then the team should be able to operate even if you're not there. And I think, that's the bit that I like to work with. That's why quite often I come to you, Jay, and say, what is your intent for this? That's why I always try and get the intent from Rev. This is a team thing. Once the intent is there and people understand what it is they're buying into and why, it just makes it that much easier because they can operate in a much more delegated fashion.
Thank you for that. Talk to us a little bit about your team. I know you've only been with us 6 months, and most of them have been here 6 months or less. So a couple of things I'm interested in. One, what characteristics do you look for in a strong team member? And then what is it that they're doing that makes them so excellent? So what are you doing with them to lead them to make them better than they would be without you? But also, what characteristics do you look for that would make them successful members of your championship team?
Yeah, Jay, look, I mean, you put me on the spot with an incredibly difficult question there. at the outset, we are talking small team dynamics here. And that is the fundamental part of what we're talking now. Our special operations community are incredibly proficient at small team dynamics. In my past, I've been remarkably fortunate to have dealt with some incredibly complex small team dynamics. When I was with the United Nations in Cambodia, my co-workers were a colonel in the Chinese National Army who'd been at Tiananmen Square. I had a Russian tank commander who'd been in the former Soviet East Germany facing me along the inner German border. I had Polish, I had Filipinos. So I've dealt with complex dynamics with the United Nations. I've done it with NATO, with our nearest and dearest partners. But when put on the mark and put on the spot, they can be incredibly complicated to work with. So what do you look for in a team? And I've got a small team now. I've got the same complex dynamics. I've got entry-level young ladies who are just literally left college, first job, full of the hope for the future. They're excited, they're keen. They don't have the experience base, but by golly, they make up for it with energy and enthusiasm. And then I've got seasoned professionals. I've got people that have been in the event planning world for 23 years. I've got a deputy who's been an 06 colonel. He's been there, seen it, done it. There's not much I can tell him, and plenty I'm sure he could tell me. So what is it that I look for? I think the most critical resource that I look for is honesty and integrity. Because if you don't have those skills, if you operate outside of the box, as it were, the foundations of the small team will implode. If one member of the team is not trusted, or is dishonest, or lacks integrity, it will out itself. You cannot hide that sort of character failing in front of a small team. It's impossible. So to me, that is the most important point. In terms of the work ethic, attention to detail. Ours happens to be a detail-oriented business. You've got to be able to look at a complex event, break it down into constituent parts, and make sure you don't drop any of the numerous balls that you've got up in the air as you systematically work through all the different parts. And small mistakes in a small team can be compounded into much larger mistakes, and we can't afford that. I prefer people to take just a little bit more time to make sure that what they were putting out was accurate, rather than rushing to failure. Rushing to failure is really not an option for us. So I think a level of detail is a critical component to what we want from them. What is it that the team look for from me? Yes, they will always want the guy that's the figurehead. They always want somebody to run their ideas off. They always want somebody ultimately that's going to say yes or no. Somebody's got to be the approval authority. But I think the skill that I would put at the highest level, and really it's not one that everyone has got, and a lot of my peer groups in the military don't have it. And I don't even know if it's a word. I think it might be an American word. I don't know if it's a British word. But it's the ability to listen. I think people call it listenership, but it is the ability to listen. Because too often as a commander, you're too busy pushing your ideas on other people. And if you're a forceful personality, you're going to step on them. And you're going to stifle creativity. And I just don't go with that, because some of the best ideas come from the people at the ground level who have got the biggest say in what's going on. And so I think people genuinely welcome somebody that is able to listen and willing to listen to what they've got to say. And this could be professional, it could be personal, it could be any number of things. But I do like to always have, figuratively speaking, an open door. If someone wants to talk to me, I'm always available to talk to them. We're just going through our sort of 6-month review with a lot of the teammates. and it's, I don't know what they expected, but they get a good solid hour with me listening to what they want to do with their lives, what they want to do with their future, and what's on their mind. And I think that people at the end of that feel just a little bit better because the management is more engaged in them. So I think in the small team dynamic, the ability to listen is absolutely critical as part of how you pull this team together and how you keep it oriented on the mission at hand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so two things: listening and making that personal relationship. I'm reading a book right now on negotiating, and it's a retired FBI hostage negotiator, and he talks a lot about listening. He doesn't call it, in academia, I'll put my professor hat on for a second, we call it active listening. So as a coach, we do a lot of coaching. That's what you do, is you listen. And I will tell you, it's intellectually exhausting to listen, because you were a leader for 34 years, and now you're a leader again, two very different worlds. But listening is one of the greatest skills you can have. But our human instinct and our commander instinct is, I've heard enough and here's the solution. And your mind immediately leaps to listening to respond rather than listening to understand. And to listen to understand and quite sincerely not preconceive the outcome, it's intellectually exhausting. I've done several dozen personality profile feedbacks in the last several weeks, and I can't do more than 2 of them a day. They're 90 minutes each. Majority of the time I'm listening, but you're listening so actively, trying to see what's not being said, what's being said between the lines, what's the real challenge here, which is rarely the first one presented. And then when you do responding back with another active inquiry question, not a solution. And then the second part of that, okay, good, jump in, I'll come back.
No, I was just going to say, as we sort of, look to the future, listening is an incredible part of small team dynamics. But the point you're also raising is an interesting one when it comes to decision making, because you want to listen to your team to help you build up a profile, to help you build up a base of information before you make a decision. But as you look to the future, and the plethora of information that is available to commanders at all levels and in all different facets of life, there comes a point where information overload may become a very real problem. And you're always there trying to get the perfect 100% solution rather than actually maybe going with the 90% solution. So, whilst I want to listen to my team and that you have to listen to the team, as you indicate, there also comes a cutoff point where you say, okay, in terms of the mission, we now have to make some decisions. And there has to be that sort of, knowledge base. It has to be an experience base that says, I've reached that point, where I've listened to my team, I've got all the inputs I need, I can't take any more on before I make this decision. And I think, as we look to the future of, our customer particularly, I think information overload is going to be a major challenge for them, because there is just too much out there. And how you sift through all that information to allow you to make that decision is going to be one of the new skills that I'm just not sure that we are absolutely prepared for in our leaders of the next 20 to 30 years. Our young cadets who are at the Air Academy now are our senior leaders in 30 years, and the world will be fundamentally different then. And the problems experienced by these people will be so strange and alien to us that we can't even begin to comprehend them now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I keep telling people, because one of the things we talk about, and you mentioned it, 30 years, teaching people to have 30-year visions. And when you initially start thinking about it, it seems inconceivable. The world's changing so fast. How could I possibly predict 30 years to the future? Well, the reality is the person who took your job when you retired was 30 years in the making. And so the person who's going to take the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, Chief of Naval Operations job is just now coming into service. And so what are we doing to prepare them? And so you and I are in education and training. What are we doing today in your catalog? Your catalog is 67 courses. I think going to grow to 68 rather soon. What's in there that's developing those leaders to take charge in that new era? Part of what gives me peace is leadership is leadership. It won't matter 30 years from now what tools they have, what enabling technologies they have. They're still going to want to be well led, and we're still going to need good leaders.
I think the principles of leadership, they stand the test of time. If you were to go back and look at historical characters, there are some facets of their character that are still, prevalent today. I mean, that is not going to change. But the world we operate in is, and you mentioned, what we're doing to train in our portfolio. Nothing stands still.
Mm-hmm.
If you think that you can just regurgitate the same old, and that's good enough, then I think you're perhaps missing the point about what education and training is all about. The world moves on, and the world is changing, and it's recognizing that change and how you can prepare people for that change. Some things are timeless, some things are not. We have taken a long, hard look at the future. The portfolio tended to be, I think, somewhat reactionary and somewhat shrouded in the here and now. And that's okay. That's really important. That is absolutely what our customer requires. But if it's to be genuinely useful across the continuum of learning and across the .mil-PF, we've got to start looking to the future a bit. And none of us has a crystal ball. But there are some things that we can start to prepare for. And the inevitable technological change is just one facet of that, because it's going to have an impact across the people we want to recruit, the people we want to train, how we organize our structures, what doctrine needs to follow. The whole of that .mil-PF is going to be affected, ranging from robotics and automation at the factory level as we start to procure equipment, all the way up to the way we make decisions to drop a bomb. And helping our senior leaders to recognize that change as such an important part of what we're doing. And so, from our perspective, that evolution and how we look at that's the critical thing that we're adding into the portfolio now to help our senior leaders look to the future.
Yeah, so something I'm dying to ask you, again, I know I'm putting you on spot, so I apologize, but that's part of the format, right? I want you thinking on your toes for these conversations. So they're not scripted answers. They're generally coming from your heart. You've described your 34 years of experience, and you have these 22-year-old superstars that are working for you. How are you going to grow them into you without 5 combat tours and 35 years and being a brigadier? How do we grow them into us when we know they're not going to have those experiences?
They're not going to have the same experiences I had. They will develop and they will generate their own experiences. I don't know. I mean, I think the bottom line is I don't necessarily know if I want somebody to grow up into me. And I know that sounds incredibly strange, but I'm a product of 2020. I think like a guy in the 2020s, but a guy who was educated in the 1980s. You know, and I keep saying to, you know, my girls, I keep saying to all sorts of people, when I was at school, we didn't have a single computer. You know, the first computer was bought by my school when I was in my 5th year, you know, so, you know, I would have been 16 years old. And frankly, I was never going to go on that computer because I played rugby and I did all those sorts of great sports and things that I wanted to do. But you know what? The world has changed. Everyone has a computer. Everyone has got a smartphone. Kids as young as 3 and 4 operate on phones now. I mean, technology has changed. So I don't want someone like me. I want someone better than me and someone that is better able to operate in the world that we're in. And that may be a very different sort of soldier in the future, soldier or airman. Because, you know, when I was in Iraq, I was taken to one of the remote piloted vehicle suites, and they had a simulator in there, and they said, "Come on, sir, on you get." And you know what? I just couldn't even lift this thing off the ground. I mean, it was fingers and thumbs. It was a degree of coordination that I just did not have. And soldiers nowadays don't need to put a heavy pack on their back and advance to contact 20 miles. They've got to sit in a room and be absolutely clear and clinical with what they're doing with these high complex bits of equipment, listen to the direction and orders given to them. So they're different. And we may need very different people in the future. We may no longer need the ISTJ type personality. We may need something that's much more feeling, much more sensitive. Someone that is much more attuned with computers. In other words, someone that doesn't look like the soldier that I was when I joined in 1985, but somebody that looks like the young kid who's at college now with all their smartphones glued to their hands, glued to their ears, and is proficient on numerous different social marketing and media tools. So I would love it if there was somebody that was going to be like me in the future. But if they were like me in the future, then they're in the wrong career and they're probably doing it all wrong. I want somebody different, and that's a different set of experiences that they're going to get through their own different way of operating. And we need to recognize that, and we need to prepare for that.
Yeah, thank you. Very humble insights. So part of what we're doing is working with the Space Force and what kind of culture do they need to create in the Space Force. And I go back and forth on this because part of me agrees with you that they don't need to be an athletic superstar. But then on the other side, I've seen in real life people in top physical shape, when they are under duress, when they are exhausted, are making better decisions and continuing to act. So I go back and forth on whether or not the Space Force or any other force in the future, I agree they're not going to need to put out a 100-pound ruck and go 20 miles with that ruck. But they still need mental and physical toughness. So how are we going to balance that in this labor market? And you know, as we get deeper and deeper into the 21st century. What are your thoughts there?
I don't know. I mean, culture is, you know, a culture is a difficult thing to put your hands around, and, you know, what does it mean? For some people, you know, it's your values, maybe it's the way you operate, maybe it's the expectations about you. There's a number of different facets about culture which make it difficult. You know, when I was at the 82nd, you know, I was asked by General Eric Kurilla to write the campaign plan for the 82nd. And I came up with sort of 3 strands. You know, one was the operational strand. One was the sort of the training strand. And the third one was interesting because it was all about culture. You know, we had an entire strand linked to culture. What does it mean to be in the 82nd? What does it mean to be an airborne soldier? And, you know, there was all the sort of, well, you know, we just got to look back to the paratroopers of the Second World War and it's all there. It's more than that. and this was the big thing I was trying to push, is this is about how you recruit the right people, how you nurture them through their time in the military, how you bring the families on board, and how you deal with them when they leave the service, the transition to being a veteran and keeping the veterans engaged and involved. In other words, I classify this cradle to grave. This is how you've got to nurture it from the inception through to the culmination. The Space Force, it's got to decide what it wants to be and how it's going to operate to achieve that culture, from the cradle to the grave, from what is it you want to recruit to what is it you want to put out at the far end. They're professional. They're dealing with a domain that is relatively new. It's been around forever, but it's relatively new in terms of our psyche. And it's an incredibly exciting one. But you're right, these are not guys that are going to be putting heavy packs on their backs. These are guys and girls that are expected to make complex decisions in complex environments. So there has to be a degree of mental resilience that goes with the sort of people that they're going to recruit and they're going to train. And their training is going to be much more focused on the mental dynamics rather than the physical exertions. That's just what I perceive is the way ahead. But they need to generate that, from the very outset, and they need to have a plan for how they transition people out at the end, because those people may well stay connected in some way, shape, or form with the Space Force. But certainly, the long-term value you have from an active lobby of veterans as well is such an important part of it. So yeah, it's hard to say, but mental resilience, I suspect, is going to be much more the determinant for this particular force than the sort of robustness that you might have expected from the Marine Corps or from me in the Army.
Yeah, I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to just talk about one more thing before we move on. And that is, in this very small force, 16,000 people, I think is what they're projecting, which will likely have a very different mission and a very different culture, but yet it's going to need joint and combined experience. And so you saw the challenges of going combined, coming from the British Army, working with the American Army. And you were able to do that because you were a brigadier in every sense of the word, and were prepared to take those chairs and do those jobs. As you said, the 3-star left, you're 2-star left, and you were the guy. So one of the things I really think hard about is we need to create a culture for the Space Force that allows that kind of cross-decking. Otherwise, they won't be a peer. There'll be something different than a peer. Or we just never expect them to serve in a joint or combined environment. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I mean, look, they have to. It's essential they do. In both environments. I mean, first of all, in the combined or the coalition world, the United States has taken a leadership line here. They have. It's the only military in the entire world that is dedicated to this particular mission set. Everyone else has it sort of obscurely hidden away within their Ministry of Defense or one of their operational headquarters. The US has taken a lead, and it must continue to take a lead. And I hope that, as they design and build out their headquarters structure, they consider the impact that some international officers can have operating with them, not just in terms of the different cultural optic that they can bring to help their decision making, but more importantly, what they then take back to their own countries to help them to generate capabilities. After all, we are a coalition, we've worked together well, we must continue to work together. That's such an important and fundamental part of what I believe in. And so they've got to maintain that. But equally, in the joint environment, you've got to send people out. They've got to gain their spurs operating within joint environments. They've got to be able to understand how the joint force works. again, because they're selling themselves and what they believe in. They're part of the mission, the Space Force, into the Joint Force. But more importantly, they're bringing back some of the expertise developed over numbers of years by the Joint Force in how they operate. So, you know, you cannot isolate and be set aside and say, this is just my mission, this is just it. You know, you've got to be able to spread that talent across. And it will be difficult initially because everyone's learning their job. And arguably all the people in the Space Force have probably come from joint backgrounds, or certainly a more joint focus. But as you get the young guys coming through, the young guys and girls coming through, they've got to have routes and paths that allow them to get out into the Joint Force to spend time, whether it's at combatant commands, whether it's at the Joint Staff, it doesn't matter what. They have got to be exposed to a much more joint force out there.
Yeah. Well, James, our hour is up. You can believe that. It zooms by. Greatly appreciate your thoughts and your time.
No, look, Joe, it's a pleasure. You know, it's good to chat about, you know, some of the big issues that are out there that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. It sort of takes you out of the nitty-gritty and makes you think a little bit. And sometimes being able to think is not a bad thing.
All right, my friend. Thank you.
So I appreciate your time. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.